Two brand new aircraft, 13 months apart, 346 people, one overlooked system. What you are about to learn is not simply a story about two plane crashes. It is a story about how one of the most trusted engineering organizations in modern history built a safety system, failed to fully disclose it to pilots, and then watched as the consequences unfolded at 30,000 feet. The Boeing 737 MAX investigation would eventually expose something far more uncomfortable than a software bug. It would reveal the hidden tensions between engineering integrity, commercial urgency, and regulatory trust, tensions that had been building for years before a single aircraft left the ground. The central question investigators would spend years trying to answer was deceptively simple. How does a company with decades of aviation excellence produce an aircraft with a system that could, under specific conditions, override a pilot's control? And why did so few people inside the organization raise a sustained alarm? By the end of this documentary, you will understand not just what happened, but why the system allowed it to happen, and why that question matters far beyond aviation. To understand the investigation, you first need to understand what was at stake before a single MAX left the ground. Boeing had been manufacturing commercial aircraft since 1916. By the early 2010s, it was one of the most recognized engineering institutions on Earth, synonymous with American industrial achievement and, crucially, with aviation safety. The 737 was the backbone of that reputation. First introduced in 1968, it had become the best-selling commercial jet in history. Airlines trusted it. Regulators understood it. Pilots had flown it for decades. It was not exotic or experimental. It was proven. Then the market moved. Airbus announced a fuel-efficient update to its own narrow-body aircraft, the A320neo, featuring new, more economical engines. Airlines responded with significant orders, and Boeing faced a commercial challenge it had not anticipated at that scale or speed. That competitive pressure set everything that followed into motion. Boeing's answer was the 737 MAX, an updated platform fitted with the same generation of fuel-efficient engines its competitor was using. But there was a problem that would quietly shape everything that followed. The new engines were larger than those on earlier 737 variants. To maintain ground clearance, engineers repositioned them further forward and higher on the wing. This altered the aircraft's aerodynamic behavior at certain angles of attack, the angle between the aircraft and the oncoming airflow. Under specific conditions, the nose had a tendency to pitch upward more than pilots would expect from an older 737. To address this, engineers developed the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS. It was designed to automatically push the nose down if sensors detected an unexpectedly high angle of attack, making the MAX feel similar to earlier variants in handling. There was also a commercial dimension to this. Boeing had assured airlines that MAX-qualified pilots would not require full simulator retraining, a significant cost saving. Full transparency about a new system that altered flight behavior would have complicated that assurance considerably. The system worked in testing, but embedded within it were assumptions that would only reveal their danger in the air. MCAS relied on data from a single angle of attack sensor. If that sensor provided inaccurate readings, MCAS would receive false information and respond to a situation that did not exist. There was no redundancy. The system was not designed to cross-check its sensor data against a second reading before acting. Investigators would later find that MCAS had been reclassified during Boeing's internal safety assessment. Its potential failure severity reduced from the most serious category to a lower one. Congressional investigators concluded this reclassification was flawed and that it reduced the redundancy required under certification standards. MCAS was also capable of re-engaging repeatedly. If a pilot applied corrective inputs, the system could reactivate after a short reset period and continue driving the stabilizer trim, the tail surface controlling pitch toward its limit in successive cycles. According to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee's final report, MCAS was omitted entirely from the Flight Crew Operations Manual. Airlines and crews were not informed of the system's existence, its activation logic, or what to do if it malfunctioned. The question of why that information was absent became one of the most consequential threads in the entire investigation. What made what happened next even more difficult to understand was this: the accident aircraft had already shown signs of trouble. The day before the fatal Lion Air flight, a different crew operating the same aircraft encountered similar uncommanded nose-down inputs and recovered by using the manual trim controls. A warning had passed through the system. It was not transmitted clearly enough to prevent what came next. On the 29th of October 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 departed Jakarta, Indonesia. The aircraft was a Boeing 737 MAX 8, carrying 189 passengers and crew. Shortly after takeoff, the crew encountered repeated, uncommanded nose-down inputs. Flight data recorders confirmed that an angle of attack sensor was providing erroneous readings. MCAS activated in response to a situation that did not exist. Within approximately 13 minutes of departure, the aircraft entered the Java Sea. There were no survivors. Then, on the 10th of March, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 departed Addis Ababa. 157 people were on board. Flight data confirmed a sequence bearing documented similarity to the Lion Air accident: a faulty angle of attack reading, repeated MCAS activation, a crew fighting for control. The aircraft did not recover. Within days of the Ethiopian Airlines crash, regulators across multiple continents had suspended the 737 MAX's operating certificate, one of the most extensive coordinated responses in modern commercial aviation. But investigators soon realized the accidents themselves were only the visible surface of a much deeper problem. The Ethiopian Accident Investigation Bureau led the inquiry into Flight 302. Indonesian authorities led the Lion Air investigation. The United States National Transportation Safety Board participated in both as an accredited representative, standard procedure when a United States manufacturer's aircraft is involved. The evidence pointed somewhere unexpected. The House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee launched a parallel congressional investigation, subpoenaing internal Boeing documents, engineering records, and communications. What they found raised questions that went beyond the accidents and into the heart of how the aircraft had been approved to fly in the first place. The investigation uncovered something even more significant than a software failure. It had found a system of oversight that had been quietly eroding for years. The investigations did not simply find a defective sensor or a poorly designed algorithm. They found something more structurally significant. The Joint Authorities Technical Review, an international panel convened in 2019, concluded that the FAA's oversight process had critical gaps. Specifically, the certification of MCAS had not adequately accounted for how pilots would respond to a system they had never been told existed. The uncomfortable truth was that this had not happened overnight. Over decades, a regulatory model had developed, the Organization Designation Authorization Program, that allowed Boeing engineers to perform certain certification tasks on behalf of the FAA. The arrangement was built on trust accumulated over generations of safe aviation. It was not inherently corrupt, but it had created conditions where the boundary between manufacturer and regulator had become difficult to see clearly. Congressional investigators found internal communications referencing schedule pressure during the MAX development program. The precise relationship between those commercial timelines and specific technical decisions remained a subject of continuing legal scrutiny. But the pattern was visible in the record. A safety system had been redesigned without adequate redundancy. Its severity had been reclassified downward. Its existence had been omitted from pilot documentation. And the regulatory structure that should have caught each of those decisions had not. Every layer of protection had a gap, and the gaps had aligned. The grounding lasted 20 months, the longest of a commercial aircraft type in aviation history. Boeing recorded billions of dollars in losses related to the grounding, production disruption, and compensation to airlines. But the legal consequences reached further. In January 2021, the Department of Justice announced a deferred prosecution agreement with Boeing related to conspiracy to defraud the United States, stemming from the company's conduct during the MAX certification process. The total financial obligation exceeded $2.5 billion in combined penalties, compensation, and support. That agreement did not hold. In 2024, a federal judge ruled that Boeing had violated its terms. The Department of Justice pursued criminal charges, and Boeing subsequently entered a guilty plea agreement, a development that extended the legal reckoning years beyond what the original settlement had appeared to close. Boeing's chief executive at the time of the crashes was removed from his position in December 2019 as pressure mounted from the board, regulators, and the public. The organization's reputation, built across a century of engineering, had been fundamentally altered. Internationally, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency conducted its own independent review before permitting the MAX to return to European skies, a significant departure from the historical practice of closely following FAA certification decisions. The aircraft returned to service in November 2020, following extensive MCAS redesign and new pilot training requirements that included, for the first time, clear documentation of the system's existence and behavior. What happened next changed industry thinking in ways that extended well beyond one aircraft program. The Aircraft Certification, Safety, and Accountability Act, signed into law in 2020, introduced reforms to how safety-critical systems are evaluated, how cockpit alerting systems must be designed, and how pilots must be involved in aircraft design assessment, changes that had been absent from the framework that approved the MAX. The FAA restructured elements of its oversight program. International regulators demonstrated a new willingness to conduct independent evaluations rather than deferring to a single national authority. The case became a reference point in engineering ethics, risk management, and corporate governance discussions across industries that had nothing to do with aviation. Because the failure pattern it revealed, inadequate redundancy, reclassified risk, omitted disclosure, eroded oversight, was not unique to aircraft manufacturing. It was a pattern that could belong to almost any complex system where commercial pressure and institutional trust operate in the same space. The 737 MAX investigation is not ultimately a story about one software system or one aircraft program. It is a story about what happens when the structures designed to catch failures are themselves shaped by the pressures that create them. Regulatory frameworks, certification processes, and safety cultures are not passive mechanisms. They are built by people operating within institutions that carry their own commercial interests, historical assumptions, and unspoken priorities. The investigation revealed that trust, the trust pilots place in their aircraft, the trust regulators place in manufacturers, and the trust passengers place in the entire system, is not self-sustaining. It requires constant, independent verification. It requires transparency. And it requires the institutional courage to slow down when something deserves a closer look. 346 people did not return from their flights. The investigation into why they were lost and what the system failed to prevent produced findings that aviation will carry forward for decades. The deeper lesson belongs to every industry that relies on complex systems, trusted institutions, and the quiet assumption that because something has worked before, it will continue to work again. That assumption is the hidden weakness inside almost every system that has ever failed. Which system do you think people trust too much today? Where do you think the hidden weakness is? In the technology, the organization, or the regulatory structure built around it? Leave your thoughts below. Every comment is part of the investigation. If this documentary gave you a deeper understanding of how complex systems fail, subscribe to Null Theory. We explore the hidden weaknesses inside technology, engineering, finance, and the institutions that shape modern life. The next investigation is already underway.